Suzanne Pilley was known for her quiet routines and love of the moorlands. Stephen Ridgewell was a forgotten man living in the shadows of those same hills. They had never met in public, yet their lives collided in a way that would leave a village haunted and a nation horrified. What began as an ordinary morning walk would unravel into one of the most chilling true crime cases the Yorkshire Dales had ever seen. On the morning of October 17, 2016, Suzanne Pilley stepped out of her stone cottage, nestled on the edge of the Yorkshire Dales. It was a chilly but clear autumn morning, with the moorlands stretching out beyond her back garden like a sea of heather and fog. Suzanne was a creature of habit. Every Monday before work, she took the same route along the high trails that wound through the hills and dipped into the valleys, a routine she rarely deviated from. She'd lived in the area her whole life and knew the moorlands like the back of her hand. Friends often joked she could walk them blindfolded. That day she wore her usual gear, hiking boots, a red waterproof jacket and a grey beanie. Her dog, Nell, stayed behind. The animal had undergone surgery just a week earlier and was recovering at home. It was one of the few times Suzanne ventured out without her constant companion. Neighbours later recalled seeing her leave just before sunrise, her figure quickly swallowed by the pale mist that clung to the hills. By midday the skies had darkened. Rain began to fall. Normally Suzanne would have been back by then, changed out of her walking clothes and ready for her shift at the local veterinary clinic. When she didn't show up, her co-workers assumed something had come up. Suzanne wasn't known to cancel without calling, but she wasn't the type to make a fuss either. The day passed. No one heard from her. That evening, her phone went unanswered. Her house, when checked by a concerned neighbour, appeared untouched. The porch light was still on, and the key she always kept under the flower pot was in its place. Her car was parked neatly in its usual spot, windshield streaked with early rain, but inside the house, something felt off. Suzanne's breakfast plate sat untouched in the sink. A mug of tea had gone cold on the counter. Her dog Nell hadn't been let out all day. The neighbour contacted the police. Within 24 hours, a missing persons report was filed. The local community responded swiftly. Suzanne was well liked and trusted. Dozens of volunteers, some who had never even spoken to her before, gathered at the village hall to join the search. Helicopters swept across the open moors, their blades chopping through the air, while officers on foot combed through the undergrowth. Search dogs picked up Suzanne's scent near the beginning of her usual trail, but it vanished less than a mile in, as though she had simply disappeared into thin air. Days passed, and the vast, open land offered nothing in return. No torn clothing, no signs of a fall, no footprints past a certain point. The area was wild but not dangerous in the way cities were. There were no cliffs nearby, no fast rivers, no known predators. The lack of evidence quickly turned suspicion away from nature and towards something more sinister. For the first time in living memory, the people of the quiet Yorkshire village began to lock their doors at night. As days turned into weeks with no trace of Suzanne Pilley, investigators widened their scope. With no physical evidence found on the moors, attention turned toward her personal life. On the surface, Suzanne had been private but ordinary. Quiet woman in her late 30s who lived alone, worked hard, and kept mostly to herself. She volunteered at an animal shelter on weekends, baked for local fundraisers, and rarely caused waves. Her life appeared simple, but as detectives began examining her digital footprint, a different version of Suzanne began to emerge, one carefully kept from public view. Her laptop, collected from the kitchen table, contained browser tabs still open. A veterinary article, a dog food order, and a trail map for the Dales were all expected. But deeper within her search history, officers found evidence of online profiles on dating sites, some under pseudonyms, and some using her real name. While not unusual in itself, what stood out were messages exchanged with a user who went by the handle RedFox23. The messages, stored over several months, began harmlessly enough. Discussions about hiking, shared photos of landscapes, suggestions for local places to meet. But as time went on, the tone shifted. RedFox23 became possessive. His messages took on an obsessive edge, with long rants about trust, betrayal, and being ignored. When Suzanne mentioned in vague terms that she had started speaking with someone new, his replies became dark and erratic. Phrases like, "You don't walk away from me and I know where you go," began appearing. Some messages included references to places only someone familiar with her routines would know. The bakery she stopped at on Sundays, the exact lay-by where she parked her car during hikes. Suzanne had never mentioned these things in her profile. Whoever Red Fox 23 was, he had been watching her closely, perhaps for longer than she realized. A request was sent to the dating site for user data. Within days, the IP address used by Red Fox 23 was traced to a rural property 15 miles from Suzanne's home. The account belonged to Stephen Ridgewell, a 39-year-old former park ranger who had been dismissed 3 years earlier after complaints of stalking 2 female hikers. Ridgewell lived alone in a run-down cottage, surrounded by dense trees and barbed wire fencing. He had no current employment, few friends, and a history of anger management issues. When detectives visited him, he denied knowing anyone named Suzanne, but a check of his recent movements told a different story. Traffic camera footage showed Ridgewell's vehicle, a rusting Land Rover with mismatched panels, driving along the single-track road leading to Suzanne's home the morning she vanished. The footage placed him there around 6:20 a.m., nearly an hour before she typically began her walk. When confronted, Ridgewell offered no explanation for his presence. There was no warrant, no body, and no witness to link him to a crime. Legally, he remained free. But in the eyes of the investigators, suspicion had just become certainty. All they needed now was proof. Winter settled over the moorlands with a heavy silence. Snow began to blanket the trails where Suzanne Pilley once walked, muting the ground and freezing any remaining hope that she might be found alive. The official search had been called off after 6 weeks. Without a crime scene, without a body, and with only circumstantial evidence linking Stephen Ridgewell to her disappearance, the case sat in a frustrating limbo. Suzanne's family held on, but with each passing day, their hope grew thinner. Investigators, however, hadn't given up. They continued monitoring Ridgewell quietly, hoping he would make a mistake. But he didn't. He rarely left his home, rarely used the internet, and kept almost entirely to himself. Then, in early January, a farmer repairing a collapsed stone wall on the northern edge of the moorland made a discovery that reignited the investigation. Just beyond the wall, buried beneath a thin layer of soil and bracken, he unearthed a black canvas rucksack. It was partially torn and waterlogged from the months of exposure. Inside, he found a collection of items that stopped him cold: a crumpled red waterproof jacket, a broken mobile phone with a shattered screen, and a spiral-bound notebook wrapped in a plastic bag. The police were called immediately. The jacket was quickly identified as the same brand and color Suzanne had worn on the day she vanished. Her name was stitched into the collar. The phone, though damaged, still contained data. Forensic teams recovered GPS logs showing her last known movements and the trail she likely took before the signal abruptly cut out. But it was the notebook that offered the most chilling insight. Its pages were filled with personal reflections, some hopeful, some anxious. Toward the back, the entries took a darker turn. Suzanne wrote about feeling watched. She described someone who wouldn't let go, and noted seeing a vehicle parked near her home on multiple occasions. On the final page, a single sentence was scrawled in capital letters: "If I vanish, it was him." The handwriting was verified as Suzanne's. Investigators wasted no time. With this new evidence, they returned to Stephen Ridgewell's property with a warrant. His house was sparse, cold, poorly lit, and filled with survivalist gear. Rifles hung on the walls. Shelves held jars of dried food and maps of the surrounding moorland, some of them marked with strange symbols. Behind a garden, shed officers found a locked wooden chest. Inside were several bags of bones. At first glance, they appeared to be animal remains, common enough for someone who had worked as a ranger. But forensic testing revealed otherwise. Among the bones was a human rib fragment, with distinct marks suggesting it had been cut with a blade. DNA analysis confirmed what everyone feared. It belonged to Suzanne. Ridgewell was arrested at dawn the next morning. He offered no resistance, no emotion, and no answers. When asked if there were more remains, he responded only with a calm, chilling sentence, "You'll never find the rest." Stephen Ridgewell was now behind bars, but the mystery of Suzanne Pilley's final moments was far from solved. With only a partial bone recovered and Ridgewell refusing to speak, prosecutors faced a difficult challenge. The public was stunned. The quiet countryside, once considered safe and peaceful, had become the backdrop for a chilling story that felt more like fiction than fact. Ridgewell remained cold and unreadable during initial interviews, answering only with vague denials or eerie silence. He never admitted to knowing Suzanne, never explained how her rib ended up in a box behind his shed, and never showed any hint of remorse. The police knew they needed more, not just to secure a conviction, but to give Suzanne's family a complete answer. The turning point came when an officer revisiting old evidence noticed something curious in a drone video captured during the earliest days of the search. In one clip, taken near a disused quarry 3 miles from Ridgewell's cottage, there was a faint outline in the ground, a patch of soil that looked slightly sunken compared to the surrounding terrain. At the time, it hadn't stood out. The area was vast, uneven, and full of animal burrows, but in hindsight it appeared suspicious. The site was remote, tucked behind a slope of heather, and nearly invisible from the trail. Officers returned with ground-penetrating radar and excavation equipment. After 3 long days of digging, they uncovered what they had feared and hoped for in equal measure. Suzanne's body, buried in a shallow grave. She had been wrapped in a torn tarpaulin, weighed down with stones, and buried with precise care. Her hands were crossed over her chest, her body intact aside from visible trauma to the ribs and jaw. The forensic team determined she had died from blunt force trauma, consistent with an attack using a heavy object. The discovery gave police more than just the truth about Suzanne's fate. Just a few feet away in the same secluded hollow, they found a second grave. This one was older, deeper, and more carefully constructed. Inside were the skeletal remains of another woman, one who had never been reported missing. Her clothes were tattered and weathered, and there was no identification, only fragments of a leather boot and a rusted pendant shaped like a star. It was a shocking revelation. Ridgewell hadn't just murdered Suzanne, he had likely killed before. The police now faced a much larger investigation. Who was the second woman? How many others had there been? Had Ridgewell used the Moorlands, which he knew better than anyone, as a personal hunting ground? The patterns suggested planning, ritual, and complete control. The discovery turned a missing persons case into a suspected serial killing. The media frenzy reignited overnight. Villagers who once dismissed the case as a tragic accident now felt the chilling truth. Evil had been hiding in plain sight. Ridgewell had lived among them for years, quiet and unnoticed. Now he was revealed as something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The trial of Stephen Ridgewell began the following autumn, nearly a year after Suzanne Pilley's disappearance. It took place in Leeds Crown Court and drew national attention. The courtroom was packed with journalists, law students, retired detectives, and ordinary citizens who had followed the story from the beginning. People wanted answers. They wanted justice, and they wanted to understand how a man like Ridgewell had hidden in plain sight for so long. The prosecution presented a meticulous case. They laid out Ridgewell's history, his past disciplinary record as a park ranger, his obsession with control, his pattern of stalking women who sought solitude. They presented digital evidence linking him to Suzanne through online messages. They showed traffic camera footage of his car near her home on the morning she vanished. They displayed the recovered rib bone, the notebook with her final warning, and the grim details of the shallow grave in the Moorlands. The discovery of a second body, still unidentified, was introduced not as evidence of a separate crime, but as proof of Ridgewell's method. Deliberate, hidden, and likely repeated, Suzanne's family sat through every session. Her mother wept silently when photos of the burial site were shown. Her father never took his eyes off Ridgewell, who sat motionless, often expressionless as the evidence was presented. He declined to speak in his own defense. His legal team argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that no witness had seen him with Suzanne, and that her death could not be definitively tied to him without a full confession. But the jury didn't need a confession. The weight of the facts, the digital trail, the buried rucksack, the bones behind his shed, and Suzanne's own written words, painted a clear and damning picture. After 5 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict. Guilty of the murder of Suzanne Pilley, Ridgewell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge described him as a manipulative predator who had used the vast unguarded landscape of the Moorlands to commit his crimes, hiding behind isolation and silence. The gallery broke into quiet sobs. Suzanne's family held each other as the sentence was read. For them, the ordeal was over, but the scars would remain. Outside the courtroom, investigators addressed the public. They confirmed that the second body had still not been identified and that other unsolved disappearances in the region were now being reviewed. Ridgewell, even behind bars, refused to speak. He offered no insight into his crimes, no details, no names. Authorities continued to search his old maps and personal writings for clues. A special task force was formed to investigate possible links to cold cases across northern England. Back in the Yorkshire Dales, locals still walk the trails, but the mood has changed. Caution has replaced comfort. A memorial plaque was placed near the trailhead where Suzanne last walked, a quiet reminder of her life and the hidden dangers even in the most familiar places. Though Ridgewell is gone, his silence continues to echo across the moors.